back. This video, I'm going to walk you through some ideas from a paper I wrote a number of years ago, presented at Baylor University for a conference on, I think it was Christ and Culture or something kind of name. I can't even remember the name of the conference. It was back in 2011. So it's been a while. But I think this paper deals with a perennial topic, and that is the topic of education considered from the wisdom of Boethius in his book called The Consolation of Philosophy. So the paper is titled The Consolation of Philosophy for Academe. Academia. Academe, I think is probably better. So again, I'll just read this, and there's a bit of logic in it, but I think if you're a philosopher interested in philosophy, the logic isn't too terribly technical. But all right, so here's the introduction. Boethius in the 6th century and Academe in the 21st century are in a crisis. It was only through the divine intervention of Lady Wisdom that Boethius was able to understand his condition and learn how to return to his true nature. I argue that Lady Wisdom can do the same for academia today. First, I pinpoint the problem for academia and show that it is the same problem Boethius faced in the Consolation. Their true nature has been forgotten. Second, I sketch the misguided solutions that Boethius thought would provide him a way out of his imprisonment. They failed for Boethius, and they fail for higher ed today. Third, I show how Lady Wisdom argues that only one thing, participation in the divine, can make Boethius and Academe truly happy. I conclude with reflections on the particular obligations of philosophically minded faculty to help the Academy fulfill its true nature. 1. Amnesia. The Consolation begins with a pathetic picture of a man in misery for attempting to do the right thing. Boethius laments, "I one who wrote joyful songs. With joyful zeal am driven by grief to enter weeping mode." Boethius recites his suffering to Lady Philosophy. But here I am, 500 miles away, condemned to death, to have my properties confiscated, silenced, with no opportunity to offer a defense. Boethius is in trouble, and he's miserable. Academia is also in trouble, appears in some way miserable, lamenting. But here am I, with a tuition bubble, a student loan debt crisis, underprepared students, overworked adjuncts, an incoherent curriculum, hyper-professionalization, and credentialism, and with no opportunity to offer a remedy. Some laments of academia. Boethius doesn't believe that he deserves his current condition. He cites the blameless life in my home, my friendship, and with the most honorable of men, and the sanctity of Symmachus, my father-in-law. All these guarantee me against suspicion. So, too, the Academy doesn't believe it deserves its own condition, citing the scientific advances in technology from universities, the sheer amount of research produced by scholars, the fact that students from around the world flock to our campuses, a BCS top 25 football team. Successes of academia. Philosophy responds to Boethius, "You've been reduced to the misery of banishment, and you have forgotten your true nature." The reason for his condition is threefold, according to philosophy. Boethius is 1, confused by loss of his memory, 2, ignorant of the end and purpose of things, and 3, forgetful by the means of which the world is governed. The Academy has also a threefold condition. Our higher education institutions have forgotten their true nature, and ignorant of their own proper end, and forgetful of the means which ultimately governs them. Boethius' major problem here was with placing his hope of happiness, that is, true well-being, on the fickleness of fortune, whose very essence is change, and whose mutability makes her a cruel mistress. Does the Academy rely on fortune, as Boethius did? Has the undergraduate curriculum stayed constant or fluctuated at most colleges and universities over the past, say, 150 years? I think that pretty obviously has changed. Universities have changed and fluctuated and spun round and round with very little constancy. For example, consider the changes in the typical schedules of our universities. In 1770, a typical day for students included a 5 a.m. wake-up followed by 5:30 a.m. compulsory prayer, study hall until 8, followed by classes from 9 to 1. Students were free until 3, and they had study time until 5 for evening prayers, 7 p.m. supper, 9 p.m. return to their room for more study and sleep. I am unaware of any major universities or colleges which require such a schedule today. Consider another example of the curriculum. In one of our oldest universities, founded in 1746, until the early parts of the 20th century, students were required to learn Latin and Greek, and 2 other foreign languages. In recent years at the same institution, you wouldn't even have to get up early to take courses such as Let's Eat, Food in Contemporary American Culture, or Dracula, Sexuality and Power. This is not to say that these courses aren't good in themselves, but it is to say that things have changed over time following fortune's fickle flow. 2. Fickle, flowing fortune. Trusting in change makes happy neither man nor Academe. Lady Philosophy logically demonstrates that happiness can't consist in the things governed by chance through several syllogisms. First, all happiness are things that are identical to the highest good. No things that they can be taken away are things identical to the highest good. Therefore, no things that can be taken away are things identical with true happiness. Here's another syllogism. No things that can be taken away are things identical with true happiness. All things that pertain to fortune are things that can be taken away. Therefore, no things no things pertaining to fortune are things that can be things identical with true happiness. There's your third argument. You can put this in the form of a syllogism. If happiness rests on fortune, then either a man does not know it's unreliable, or a man does know it's unreliable. Affirm premise A. Happiness does rest on fortune. Let's assume that. Then what you have is a man doesn't know it's unreliable. If a man doesn't know it's unreliable, then he can't live in ignorance due to blind happiness. And if a man knows it's unreliable, then he can't live in happiness due to a constant fear of losing it. So now we end up with B or C. From premise 1 by modus ponens, which ends up giving us a man doesn't know it is unreliable, or a man does know it is unreliable. But then by a constructive syllogism, we end up with he can't live in ignorance due to blind ignorance, or he can't live in ignorance due to constant fear of losing it. So, nice little argument there to show that fortune can't produce happiness. Here's a fourth argument. Premise 1. If happiness rests on fortune, then death is a misery. But death isn't a misery. He's assuming the Christian resurrection of the dead, of course. Therefore, happiness can't rest on fortune. So the challenges of the soundness of these arguments come at various points. Premise 1.1 would be false if some things identical with true happiness are not things identical with the highest good. One might believe that one's true happiness consists in something that is not part of the highest good. For example, one might believe that wealth or power or fame, etc., was part of true happiness, but not part of the highest good. And I think this belief shows up in higher ed. The true happiness of education is not identified with the highest good, but is thought to be separable from it being found in job training or technical expertise, rather than the soul's final end. So if the telos of Academe is mere employment or employability, then 1.1 will be false. But surely 1.1 can't be false. Again, what premise am I referring to? Is the premise that all happiness, or things identical with happiness, things identical with true happiness are the highest good. Okay, if you want to show that that's false, right? But I don't think that premise is false, as true happiness and the highest good seem coextensive. A truly happy Academe will be inseparable from an Academe which reaches its telos. One can prove that the telos of the Academe is something other than employment or employability in the same way one discovers the telos of anything. One identifies the essence of the things and then finds the telos in the essence. We must remember that the Academe is an artificial organism. I want to call it an organism, but it's an artifice at least. It's a human artifact, but its end is not merely instrumental, as most artifacts are, because the Academe operates on those engaged in using it. The telos of the Academe as human-made organism is operative upon human beings. Therefore, necessarily, the Academe's telos is part and parcel of the human telos. That end will be the highest good for human beings, and that end surely is not mere employment. Therefore, premise 1 is not false on these grounds. What about premise 2.1? So this is from the second argument that I gave, and that premise is no things that can be taken away are things identical with true happiness. So let's consider that particular premise. This is premise 2.1. What about premise 2.1? Well, it would be false just in case there are things that can be taken away that are identical with true happiness. What might these be? Again, the likely suspects are material goods, the loss of which Boethius was lamenting. For university life, such goods might include credits, significant motivation for many students that I've bumped into over the years. Credits are incredibly important things. I often joke with my students that go over to the registrar's office and ask to see their box of credits. I don't think any of you have taken me up on this. I haven't got any emails from any registrars asking why I'm bothering them in this way with my students. Or perhaps a degree with various rights and privileges. You get a diploma from a school. I've got a couple, and they say on there, this degree is awarded to you on this date and conferred by these people with various rights and privileges. They're never enumerated. I don't know what those rights privileges are. Or perhaps a job, right? So credits, rights and privileges, or a job. Again, each of these things can be taken away. They can't be taken as part and parcel of true happiness if true happiness is complete and an end in itself. Thus, premise 2.1 stands. What about premise 3.3? Okay, this is a kind of an interesting little premise here. 3.3 is, let's see, I think we need 3.1 here. 3.3. Okay, yeah, it's 3.3. If a man knows happiness resting on fortune is unreliable, then does this imply that he can't live in happiness due to blind ignorance? Well, suppose the Academy believes that happiness rests on fortune, money, jobs, degrees, publications, etc., but is unaware that fortune is unreliable. Does this blind ignorance prohibit happiness? Well, yes. It's simply a lack of awareness of the reality of the essential nature of the Academy. So too does the awareness that happiness contingent on fortune is unreliable. Constant fear of losing status, maybe USNR rankings, maybe, will keep the Academy from pursuing happiness in its essence. This premise from Boethius' third argument is true for the Academy and for human beings. What about 4.2? In the Consolation, Lady Philosophy assumes that there are good arguments for the soul's immortality. She states, "You are a man to have been fully convinced by innumerable proofs that the human mind cannot die. A lot hinges on this. If the soul is immortal, then of course death may not be a misery. If a naturalist ontology were true, then of course 4.2 would be true. And this implies something for the secular Academy. How do you convince your students that there's an ultimate telos to the Academy if it all comes crashing down at the end of our lives? You might take Bertrand Russell's poetic notions, quote, "For man condemned today," I wish I could do this with a British accent. "For man condemned today to lose his dearest, tomorrow himself to pass through the gates of darkness, there remains only to cherish, ere yet the blow falls, the lofty thoughts that ennoble his little day." Now, that's pretty good poetry, I guess, but not particularly motivating for some ultimate end. For both the Christian and non-naturalist secular Academy, there have been innumerable proofs given in the history of philosophy that death is not a misery. In the Apology, Socrates claimed that death could harm no man. For the fear of death is indeed the pretense of wisdom, and not real wisdom, says Socrates, being a pretense of knowing the unknown, and which no one knows, whether death men in their fear apprehend to be the greatest evil may not be the greatest good. He firmly adds, Know of a certainty that no evil can happen to a good man, either in this life or after death. Thus, at least for the old pagans, there were good reasons to think that death was not a misery. For Christians, the Creed says, we look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Death is not a misery. This argument, premise 4.3, stands for Boethius. So how does this connect to the Academy? When teaching the Apology, I often ask my students if they would continue studying at the university, even if it meant that they would be unlikely to get a job after college. Ask them if they would still seek to develop their intellects if having a degree made them unemployable, or if studying at the university meant risking their lives. Many students appear incredulous at the question. Why spend the time, money, energy, etc., to pursue a degree that might get you killed? But if the sort of happiness that rests on fate is all there is for their education, rests on fortune, I should say, is all there is for education, then death with this sort of education would indeed be a misery. 7 years of college down the drain. A lot of people go to college for 7 years. But if death is not a misery, if the soul is immortal, college, whether 7 years or more, will pour into eternal life. It will do something to the soul which prepares one for eternity and transcends the fickleness of fortunes and the job market. Premise 4.2 must be defended if academia is to be happy. After Lady Philosophy helps Boethius think through the solution to the problem by means of the applications of reasoning, she proceeds to enumerate the various things which Boethius thinks will make him happy, and shows that they have no part in true happiness. She presents a litany of things which cannot make a man, or the Academe, happy. Wealth, for example. The value of wealth comes when money is transferred to others in the exercise of liberality, and ceases to be possessed that it becomes valuable. An Academe, income from a job. Jewels. If there's any special quality in this brilliance, it's the light of precious stones, not of men. The diploma, maybe? Land. The beauty of property does not have anything to do with you. You don't take credit for the splendor. House in the burbs, maybe? Beauty. I remember as an undergraduate, there was a friend of mine who had in his dorm room a picture of this beautiful house, mansion overlooking the ocean, the fancy car out front, and it said justification for higher education. Beauty. If clothing catches my eye, my admiration will be directed at the quality of the material or the skill of the tailor, says Lady Philosophy in the Consolation. Maybe this would be equivalent to a ring before the spring, maybe? Power. You cannot impose anything on a free mind, and you cannot move it from its state of inner tranquility to a mind at peace with itself, firmly founded on reason. There necessarily exists among kings a larger share of misery, says Lady Philosophy about power. Some universities brag that certain percentages of their alumni work for Fortune 500 companies, or are senators, or presidents, or in government, run companies. Fame. Just think how puny and insubstantial fame really is. This great earth as is time. The next quarter of the globe will never even heard of you, says Lady Philosophy. Your degree is recognized around the world. High office. More than removing wickedness, high office brings it to light. Take the example of a man who has been a consul many times and comes by chance among foreign peoples. Universities often claim X number of our alumni have been elected to public office. Their assistants to the regional manager. How about bodily pleasure? Its pursuit is full of anxiety, and its fulfillment is full of remorse. Some universities are pretty psyched about their party school affiliation. I think there are rankings of these you can find. Well, Lady Philosophy concludes by saying, the sum of all this is that because they can neither produce the good they promise nor come to perfection by the combination of all goods, these things are not the way to happiness, and cannot by themselves make people happy. So if none of these things can make human beings happy, then they cannot, mutatis mutandis, make the Academe happy. 3. The summum bonum. What alone can make Boethius and the Academe happy? It's crucial to note that human and academic happiness begin with prayer. Philosophy says to Boethius and says to the Academe, today we ought to pray to the Father of all things. This prayer has 3 crucial components. 1. Recognition that God's rule is rational. 2. That all things have their proper end in God. And 3, we need God's intervention to have our mind's eye firmly fixed on that end. Once Boethius has the proper spiritual mindset, Lady Philosophy moves to argue that only by participation in the divine can an individual, and I would argue the Academe, be truly happy. The notion of participation in the divine is not spelled out directly in some sort of 12-step plan in the Consolation. However, Lady Philosophy argues that there are 3 things that are identical to one another: the good itself, happiness, and God. She concludes God is to be found in goodness itself and nowhere else. This implies then that the proper end of the thing can only be found within the respect to its seeking its own proper end. Participation in the divine comes about by an actualization of one's essence. The Academe thus will participate in God, only be truly happy when it strives humbly in prayer to actualize its proper end. Philosophy, wisdom, is crucial to that role, just as she was crucial for Boethius in his imprisonment. Philosophy focuses the mind logically, turns the mind to God, and remains as a careful handmaid, serving the Academe towards its proper end. The story doesn't end here for Boethius. Though his mind is now focused on the way out of his imprisonment, he still has this problem, partly intellectual, partly practical. He can't understand the context of his imprisonment, as he wrestles with the practical realities in which his exile consists. He states, the greatest cause of my sadness is really this: the fact that in spite of a good helmsman to guide the world, evil can still exist and pass unpunished. Even though Lady Philosophy gives a careful explanation of the connection between evil and the punishment of the just in books 4, Boethius is still troubled. He states, why is all turned upside down? Why good men are impressed by punishments reserved for crime, and bad men can snatch the rewards that belong to virtue, surprises me very much. I'd like to know from you the reason for this very unjust confusion. Philosophy responds by saying that the solution to Boethius' problem involved many interconnected issues. She claims that there are 5 things that need to be understood to make sense of God's plan for the cosmos. 1. Providence, oneness of providence, the course of fate, the haphazard nature of chance, divine foreknowledge and predestination, and freedom of will. She proceeds to address these 5 things in the last chapter of the Consolation, about 35 pages. It's a lot to do in a short space, but philosophy tries to connect it all together. The analogy between Boethius and the Academy at this point is this. The Academy, like Boethius, is not where it ought to be. Now again, I don't speak of any particular academy. I speak of academia, broadly speaking, especially here in the United States. The Academy, like Boethius, is not where it ought to be, but many within it wonder how it got here and marvel, looking for the reason for this very unjust confusion. Whatever these reasons, philosophy has something for Boethius to do. In conclusion, professional philosophers and philosophical professionals have obligations to help the Academy fulfill its true nature. The discipline of philosophy is academically closest in its professional work to the ultimate telos of the Academy. Philosophy concludes her dialogue, admonishing Boethius by saying this: God is foreknowledge and rests as a spectator from on high of all things, and as the ever-present eternity of his vision dispenses reward to the good and punishment to the bad, it adapts itself to the future quality of our actions. Hope is not placed in God in vain, and prayers are not made in vain. For if they are the right kind, they cannot but be efficacious. Avoid vice, cultivate virtue, lift up your mind to the right kind of hope, and put forth humble prayers on high. A great necessity is laid upon you, if you will be honest with yourself, a great necessity to be good, since you live in the sight of a judge who sees all things. So all lovers of wisdom must exemplify several virtues. 1. Faith in God's providence for the healthy Academy. 2. Hope through prayer. 3. Love for a good God. An Academe, like Boethius, has been exiled. I'm tempted to blame this exile on cruel fortune and undeserved suffering brought on us from without. When asked to state what's wrong with the world today, a wise man might do well to say, I am. Boethius realized this, and exemplifying faith, hope, and love, was martyred St. Severinus on October 23rd, 525, led from exile to his true home. May we too, with Lady Wisdom's help, follow Boethius home. Thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. You!